Night in Vietnam is never truly quiet. Even when no one is shooting, the jungle breathes. Insects chirp, leaves whisper. Somewhere far away a dog barks. But there was one silence that could not be heard with the ears. It was felt with the skin. And if it came, soldiers knew. There was almost no time left. This silence appeared after a short radio message, without emotion, without explanation. Just two words that no one said out loud: arc light. For most infantrymen, this was not the name of an operation. It was a warning. Not that a battle was about to begin, but that the battle was already over. Just not for everyone yet. Somewhere far away, thousands of kilometers from the jungle, in darkness, at an altitude unreachable by ordinary anti-aircraft guns, aircraft were already flying. They could not be heard. They could not be seen. They were not searching for targets with their eyes. They were simply following a course defined by numbers. And if those numbers coincided with your location, nothing else mattered. The most terrifying thing about arc light was not destruction, not fire, not even death. The most terrifying thing was waiting. Soldiers on the ground did not hear the approaching aircraft. They did not see flashes in the sky. There was no engine roar, no sirens, no warning. First, nothing. Then the sensation that the air had become heavier, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Experienced fighters said that before the strike, it felt as if the horizon disappeared. You looked around and could not understand where up was and where down was. The compass stopped mattering. Landmarks vanished even before the terrain itself vanished. Some tried to run. Some lay down on the ground, pressing themselves against it as if to the last anchor of reality. Some simply stood, because they did not know where to run. Arc light left no correct decisions. For those who called it in by radio, it was a different fear. The officer looked at the map and saw only a grid of coordinates. He knew that somewhere there was the enemy, and he knew that somewhere nearby there might be his own men. He understood. In a few minutes, the territory inside those numbers would stop being territory. It would become a fact. The infantry feared the enemy. Everyone feared arc light. When the first explosions arrived, they did not sound like ordinary detonations. It was not a series of blasts. It felt as if the earth was breaking in layers, one after another. The air struck the chest, then the back, then the chest again, as if the world were trying to push you out of yourself. But between the order and the explosion, there was always a pause. It was inside this pause that people broke. Viet Cong fighters later said they learned to recognize this moment, not by sound, by sensation. Like animals before an earthquake, they knew. If you did not escape in the first seconds, what you did afterward no longer mattered. American soldiers said something else. They said that in those minutes, they did not pray to survive. They prayed that the coordinates would be accurate. Arc light did not choose. It did not distinguish shape, color, side, language. It simply erased a section of the world and then moved on. And when everything ended, another silence came. Not night silence, not living silence. The silence after arc light was empty. It meant that either the enemy was gone, or that no one could be found anymore. And sometimes, that no one could be found at all. It is with this silence that the story begins. Not with fire, but with silence. The B-52 was not designed for Vietnam. It was never designed for a war with jungles, villages, trails, and people hiding under trees. It was built for a different reality, for a world where war lasts hours, not years, for a scenario in which after the first strike, it no longer matters who wins. In the early 1950s, the Pentagon was not thinking about insurgents. It was thinking about cities, about factories, about runways, about maps without names, only targets, the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction. The B-52 was meant to fly high, long, and carry a payload deadly enough to erase an entire region from the map. It was enormous. 8 engines. A wingspan comparable to a football field. A crew like that of a small ship. Its silhouette was not supposed to appear over a battlefield. It was meant to pass above the clouds, drop its load, and disappear, leaving emptiness behind. When the B-52 first took to the air, no one imagined that one day it would be used to support infantry. That sounded absurd. A strategic bomber against men with rifles and shovels. But it was precisely in this absurdity that the future tragedy lay. Vietnam was not a war for which the United States had a ready tool. Tanks got stuck. Artillery could not reach. Infantry drowned in the jungle. The enemy did not hold front lines. He vanished, dissolved, returned. And the longer the war went on, the more commanders searched for a way to regain the feeling of control. The B-52 became that way. At first it was experiments, strikes on remote areas, demonstrations of power, psychological pressure. No one was sure it would work. But each new report repeated the same thing. After the strike, the enemy disappeared. Thus, the name Arc Light appeared. It sounded almost harmless. A light arc. Something technical, neutral. There was no fire, no screams, no bodies in the name. Only procedure. Arc Light became a compromise between strategic and tactical war. Aircraft created to destroy states were now destroying squares on a map. Strikes were planned in advance, routes calculated, coordinates passed along a chain in which each participant saw only part of the picture. B-52 crews did not see the enemy. They did not see their own. They saw numbers, altitudes, wind speed, and time marks. For them, arc light was work. For those below, a sentence. Inside Air Force Command, tension existed. Some officers understood. Using such a weapon in such a war was dangerous. Not technically, morally. Because when you get used to erasing territory, you stop thinking about what is on it. But war did not allow time for doubt. Every day brought reports of ambushes, losses, growing lists of dead. And each time, arc light seemed like a solution. Fast, effective, clean. The B-52 did not miss. It simply did not ask. By the middle of the war, bombers regularly flew missions that crews were not allowed to question. They knew only one thing. If arc light was activated, somewhere on the ground, a commander had decided there was no other option left. An aircraft built for the end of the world became a routine participant in a war in which the end never came. Arc light was not improvisation. It looked like pure mathematics. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. On the ground, everything began with a request. Usually, it was made by a unit commander who was either already in contact with the enemy or expected contact in the coming hours. Sometimes it was a desperate call. The unit was pinned down, ammunition running low, evacuation impossible. Sometimes it was cold calculation. Intelligence reported an enemy concentration, and command decided to erase the problem before it became a battle. The request went up the chain. Each level added a signature. Each signature removed a portion of responsibility. At some point, the request stopped being a plea for help and became numbers, coordinates, a map square, size of the strike zone. At that moment, the war lost faces. Then, officers who had never been in the jungle took over. They had never heard insects scream or felt humid air press on the chest. They worked in air-conditioned rooms with large maps on the walls. Their task was simple: ensure that there were no friendly forces in the strike zone, or at least that the probability was minimal. Minimal did not mean zero. When the decision was made, arc light activated like a mechanism. Aircraft could already be in the air, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from the target. Crews received updated coordinates in flight. For them, this was routine. They did not know who requested the strike or why. They knew only that the order was legal and confirmed. Between decision and strike, time passed. Sometimes hours, sometimes less, but almost always enough time for someone on the ground to begin to realize. Infantry knew. If arc light was approved, it was almost never canceled. Too many people were involved. Too many aircraft already aligned. Stopping the process meant admitting error, and errors in such a system were rarely admitted. The strike zone was enormous. One B-52 pass covered an area large enough to contain several football fields. And that was only one aircraft. Usually, they operated in groups, waves, overlapping zones so that no empty sections remained. On paper, everything looked perfect. In reality, no. Coordinates could be outdated. The enemy could move. Friendly units could advance faster than expected. In the jungle, distances deceive. What looks far on a map can be close on the ground. And yet arc light was used again and again, because it gave the feeling of control. Commanders on the ground felt they could finally strike an enemy who always slipped away. Officers in headquarters saw clean reports. After the strike, enemy activity dropped. Radio intercepts recorded chaos. Intelligence reported destroyed camps. But no one counted those who simply vanished. Arc light worked, but it worked like a hammer used to repair a watch. In reports, it was called time to effect. On the ground, it was called something else. 9 minutes in which a person understood that he controlled nothing. When the B-52 reached its release point, no one below knew it. No sirens, no warning. The aircraft was too high to hear, too far to see. The only sign was a sensation, a strange tension, like before a storm. The bombs left the aircraft without drama. No jerk, no flash. They simply went down. From several kilometers up, they fell for a long time. Not seconds, tens of seconds. In that time, a person could think, choose, make a mistake. But almost no one knew a choice even existed. The first explosions were not the worst. They were orientation points. The ground jolted as if struck by a giant hammer. Air compressed and expanded, knocking breath from lungs. Those farther away often thought it was over. They were wrong. Arc light worked in waves. While the first bombs tore the ground, the next were already falling. Explosions overlapped, becoming continuous pressure. It was not like ordinary shelling. There was no direction, no way to tell where the strike came from. Space itself became hostile. Survivors said they lost sense of time. Seconds stretched. Thoughts tangled. Some ran and died running. Some fell and did not rise. Some survived only because they happened to be between impacts, in a narrow strip of random survival. Even survivors were rarely the same. After several minutes, sound disappeared. Not because it became quiet, but because ears could no longer perceive. A strange, padded silence came, where you could see a comrade's mouth open, but not hear his scream. 9 minutes was the average duration of a full strike, sometimes less, sometimes more. When the last explosion ended, the world did not return immediately. Air was filled with dust, smoke, the smell of explosives and burning earth. The sun, if present, turned into a dull spot. The jungle vanished as if it had never existed. Commanders at safe distances noted in logs, strike completed. For those inside the zone, nothing was completed. They stood up if they could, looked around, tried to understand where they were. Often they did not recognize the terrain. Hills vanished. Ravines became craters. Trails ended in nothing. The hardest part began afterward. Arc light did not just kill. It broke structure. Units lost contact. Commanders disappeared. Orders lost meaning. People who survived often left, even if they physically could fight. 9 minutes decided the fate of a piece of war. But the price was not only destruction. Part 5. The land after the strike. When the aircraft left, the war did not end. It simply changed shape. The first thing that struck those entering an arc light zone was the absence of reference points. The jungle was no longer jungle. Trees lay in one direction, as if smoothed by a giant hand. Vegetation was pressed into the earth. Where paths had been, chains of craters now stretched. The ground became soft and treacherous. A step, and your foot sinks. A step, and you trip on roots once hidden. Mines and traps laid before the strike shifted, or turned outward, becoming random threats to everyone. Bodies were not always found. Sometimes, they were never found. Those in the epicenter simply did not exist in a normal sense. From units remained fragments, weapons without owners, helmets, documents, torn maps. Commanders assessing results often wrote destroyed, where erased would have been more accurate. But Arclight did not always completely destroy. And that was worse. Survivors often did not understand what had happened. They emerged from craters, debris, earth, stunned and disoriented. Many could not speak. Some did not recognize their own men. Units lost cohesion, not because they were beaten, but because there was nothing left to organize around. For American soldiers, entering a strike zone was a double feeling. Relief. The enemy was gone. And anxiety. Too quiet, too empty. Arclight won space, but did not hold it. Arclight was not a surprise for the Viet Cong. It was a revelation. At first, the strikes were perceived as something temporary. Another American tactic. Another way to intimidate. The Viet Cong had already seen many things. Napalm, artillery, helicopters, chemicals. All of it killed, but all of it could be resisted. You could hide, disperse, wait it out. Arclight broke this logic. It did not search for a target. It destroyed space. The first strikes caused panic. Units that found themselves under the bombardment simply disappeared. Communications were cut. Commanders did not return. Those who survived brought back stories that did not fit into familiar ideas of combat. They did not speak about the enemy, but about the sky. Not about soldiers, but about the ground that was exploding by itself. But the Viet Cong did not break. They adapted. NVA commanders quickly understood. Arclight could not be survived in the usual sense. It could only be avoided. A new phase of the war began. A war of dispersion. Camps were no longer large. There were fewer supply depots. Units were broken into small groups that did not stay in one place longer than a few hours. The main weapon became rumor. If information about a coming strike passed through villages, the area emptied out. People left for the jungle, for the mountains, underground. Sometimes too early, sometimes too late. But the very fact of waiting for a strike began to change behavior, even before the aircraft appeared. Arclight was turning into an instrument of pressure, even when it was not used. Underground tunnels were dug deeper. Shelters were built to withstand the shockwave. But even the deepest bunkers did not provide certainty. The ground could collapse. Exits could disappear. Viet Cong fighters said the most frightening thing was to survive underground and not find a way back out. The fear of Arclight was special. It could not be directed at the enemy. It could not be drowned out by gunfire. It did not provoke rage. It provoked caution. Over time, fear became background, like rain, like heat, like a constant threat. NVA fighters taught recruits not how to survive a strike, but how not to be where one was possible. This changed the very character of the war. Contacts became shorter. Ambushes, faster. Withdrawals, planned in advance. The Americans saw this as success. The enemy became less active. Areas were cleared without a fight. But inside the Viet Cong, Arclight became part of a survival ritual. It did not destroy will. It disciplined it. People grew accustomed to living with the thought that at any moment, something could come from above to which there was no answer. It was here that the main paradox of Arclight revealed itself. It was too big to be decisive, too powerful to be precise, too terrifying to break those who had already accepted the possibility of death. In the next part, we will look at the other side of this story, the Americans who also found themselves under the bombs, and the moments when arc light began to strike not the enemy, but trust inside the U.S. Army. Arc light was conceived as a means of protection, but war rarely respects intentions. The first cases, which people tried not to talk about, looked like exceptions. An error in coordinates, a communications failure, an inaccurate unit position on the map. In reports, dry formulations were used. Probable zone overlap, unconfirmed presence of friendly forces. Behind these words was what soldiers called more simply, their own under the bombs. The infantry quickly learned a rule. If arc light was activated over an area, you could not trust the map more than your own feet. But even this did not always save them. Units advanced faster than the data was updated. Radio communication was interrupted. Coordinates froze in time while people on the ground were already in another place. And then the sky did what it had been summoned to do. Survivors said that the first explosion was taken for enemy artillery. Only a few seconds later came the understanding of the scale. Too powerful, too uniform, too impersonal. In such moments, anger did not arise. Confusion arose, almost resentment, as if you had been erased by mistake, but it was already impossible to cancel it. Commanders on the ground found themselves trapped. To acknowledge the mistake meant acknowledging that the system had failed. Not to acknowledge it meant leaving people without explanation. Many reports simply disappeared into the archives. Others were rewritten. Losses were explained by enemy fire or unknown causes. Formally, everything remained within acceptable limits. In reality, trust began to crack. Soldiers stopped perceiving arc light as salvation. It became something you needed to stay away from. Some units tried not to request strikes even in critical situations. Better to risk a firefight than to end up inside an error that no one would later want to discuss. This hit young officers especially hard. They were taught to trust the system, to coordinate actions, to work in conjunction. Arc light was supposed to be the pinnacle of this coordination, the highest level of support. When it failed, the very logic of what was happening collapsed. A hidden fear appeared, not of the enemy, of their own command. Some veterans later admitted that it was after such episodes that the war stopped seeming fair. Not in a moral sense, in a structural one. As if the rules no longer worked. As if even correct actions could lead to death if somewhere in the chain someone put a signature in the wrong place. Arc light continued to be used. Officially, successfully. But beneath the surface, tension accumulated. Infantry began to see in the sky not only support, but also a threat. This changed behavior, changed decisions, changed how soldiers related to orders. A war that was already chaotic became even more alienated. In the next part, we will see how arc light turned from a military instrument into a political symbol, and why it continued to be used even when its effectiveness began to decline. By the time arc light entered the habitual rhythm of the war, it stopped being just a military measure. It became an argument. In headquarters, the numbers looked convincing. After each strike, a decrease in enemy activity was recorded. Radio intercepts showed chaos. Intelligence reported destroyed bases and disrupted supply routes. On paper, arc light worked exactly the way it was expected to. The problem was that the war was not fought on paper. The more often arc light was used, the less it meant on the ground. The enemy learned to leave in advance. Areas that were struck increasingly turned out to be empty. But in reports, this did not look like failure. Emptiness was interpreted as success. The enemy disappeared. Therefore, he had been driven out. Thus, arc light became a convenient instrument, not only for commanders, but also for politicians. Each strike could be presented as proof of determination, as a demonstration of power, as a signal not only to the Viet Cong, but also to allies and adversaries around the world. From a strategic point of view, this made sense. From a strategic point of view, the B-52 continued to perform its original role, showing that the United States was capable of erasing any point on the map. But Vietnam was not a map. Soldiers on the ground increasingly spoke about a strange feeling of uselessness. Areas were cleared, but there was no one to hold them. The enemy returned to places where there were no bombs and left places where they appeared. The war was turning into the movement of shadows around zones of destruction. Arc light created the illusion of control. The illusion was powerful. Commanders who doubted it rarely spoke openly. To object to arc light meant to go against numbers, reports, and the visual obviousness of destruction. Too much looked convincing to ask uncomfortable questions. And there were questions. If the weapon was so effective, why was the war not ending? If the enemy disappeared after every strike, why did he return again and again? If we were erasing territories, why did control over them remain temporary? These questions increasingly remained unanswered. Arc light continued to be expanded. Strikes went beyond South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the North. Geography grew faster than the understanding of consequences. Aircraft flew, bombs fell. The war became wider, but not closer to completion. For many B-52 crews, this was the moment when service began to lose clarity. They carried out orders, precisely, professionally. But more and more often they asked themselves, what exactly are we doing? Not at the level of politics, at the level of meaning. Arc light was no longer the final argument. It became habitual, and this was its main danger. When absolute force becomes routine, it stops frightening those who make decisions and continues to frighten only those who are below. In the next part, we will go beyond a single theater of war and look at how arc light crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable, turning from a military instrument into an international problem. When arc light went beyond the borders of South Vietnam, the war ceased to be local, even on paper. It became a shadow covering entire countries. Cambodia and Laos were officially not part of the conflict. According to documents, neutral territories. In reality, corridors, trails, supply bases, places where the war simply was not called a war. It was precisely there that arc light began to arrive. Decisions were made quietly, without public discussion, without markings on maps that soldiers saw. Aircraft flew at night. Strikes were not publicized. Reports moved through separate channels. The wording was careful, vague, almost sterile. But the bombs fell the same way as before, without warning, without the possibility of shelter. For B-52 crews, this changed little. Coordinates were coordinates. Air corridors were air corridors. An order remained an order. But for the war as a whole, this meant crossing a line that later would be impossible to explain. Arc light ceased to be a response to a threat. It became an instrument of pressure. In Cambodia, the strikes destroyed not only bases, but the very structure of society. Villages emptied. People fled without knowing exactly whom they were running from. The Americans, the Viet Cong, the war itself, which no longer had clear sides. Historians would later say that it was this phase that made the conflict irreversible. When bombs fall where war is officially not being fought, trust disappears completely, not only toward the enemy, but toward the very idea of rules. Arc light created craters, not only in the ground, it created them in politics. Each new strike required explanations that could not be given openly. The public was not supposed to know. Allies were not supposed to ask questions. Soldiers were supposed to carry out orders. Thus, the system closed in on itself, continuing to function even when the strategic objective became increasingly blurred. On the ground, the effect was dual. On the one hand, supply routes were disrupted. On the other hand, the enemy adapted, going deeper, becoming even less visible. The war once again changed its form, slipping away from a weapon created to end it. Arc light still frightened, but it no longer decided. At that moment it became clear what for a long time people did not want to admit. A force that erases everything does not know how to choose. And a war in which there is no choice cannot end in victory. In the next, final part, we will return to where it all began and see what remained after the sky became empty, and why arc light became not the finale of the war, but its echo. At some point, arc light simply disappeared, without ceremony, without a final strike, without a sense of completion. Aircraft stopped flying out as often, then almost stopped altogether. In reports, this was explained by shifts in priorities, negotiations, political decisions. On the ground, it was felt differently, as if the sky, which people had grown accustomed to fearing, suddenly became indifferent. For some, this was a relief. For others, anxiety. Soldiers who had lived through arc light often said that the absence of strikes was stranger than their presence. When the sky was silent, a question arose. If entire areas were no longer being erased, did this mean that the war was returning to the human being? To the face, to contact, to the very thing they had tried to move away from the very beginning? The land that had survived the bombardments did not recover quickly. Some areas remained empty, not because it was impossible to live there, but because there was no desire to return. Memory was embedded in the terrain. Craters filled with water, but were not forgotten. The jungle slowly closed over the scars, but did not erase the feeling that something there had been permanently broken. The Viet Cong and the NVA survived, not because arc light was weak, but because it was too big. It could not pursue. It could not hold. It could not adapt as quickly as people who lived with war every day. When the strikes stopped, the enemy simply returned, not to the same places, but to the same war. American soldiers left carrying different burdens. Some considered arc light a salvation, moments when death passed them by. Others, a curse.